the basis of aesthetic judgment in Aquinas and Kant. Where does beauty reside? Is it, as the saying goes, in the eye of the beholder, or is beauty in the object being beheld, there to be discovered on the basis of objective criteria? Thomas Aquinas and Immanuel Kant present two differing approaches to the question of the basis of aesthetic judgment, with Aquinas basing aesthetic judgment on certain objective criteria found in the object being judged, and Kant basing aesthetic judgment in the subjective feelings of the viewer, which are then assumed to be shared by other subjects. These two approaches to the basis of aesthetic judgment will be compared in relation to the location of beauty, the foundation of judgment, the apprehension of beauty, the criteria of judgment, and the universality of the judgment. The basis of aesthetic judgment in Aquinas. For Thomas Aquinas, beauty resides in the object. As he wrote in his exposition of the divine names, things are not beautiful because we love them. We love things because they are beautiful. Given that Aquinas recognizes that objective beauty is found in material things, how is it that he defines beauty? Thomas' definition of beauty is found in his Summa Theologiae. Beautiful things are those which please when seen. Foundational to Aquinas' approach to aesthetic judgment is the relationship of beauty and the good. Aquinas makes a case for the transcendentality of beauty in his exposition of the divine names, where he declares with Plato that everything is both good and beautiful. In his Summa Theologiae, Aquinas argues that beauty and goodness in a thing are identical fundamentally, for they are based upon the same thing, namely the form, and consequently goodness is praised as beauty. Form is what makes something what it is, and it is as form that beauty is apprehended through the senses. Although beauty and goodness are fundamentally identical, they are logically distinct from each other. Aquinas distinguishes the good as appetitive, which simply delights the appetite, and being what all things desire, from beauty, which is cognitive, which calms the desire, by being seen or known, and which please when seen. In contrast to the good, which has reference only to the will, Aquinas argues that the beautiful has a reference to the intellect as well as the will. In terms of causality, the good belongs to final causality, having the aspect of an end, the appetite being a kind of movement towards a thing, while the beautiful properly pertains to formal causality. How is beauty apprehended? Aquinas argues that beauty is apprehended especially through the senses of hearing and sight, since they are more cognitive than the other senses and are connected to human reason. Consequently, those senses chiefly regard the beautiful, which are the most cognitive, vis-a-vis sight and hearing as ministering to reason, for we speak of beautiful sights and beautiful sounds, but in reference to the other objects of the other senses, we do not use the expression beautiful, for we do not speak of beautiful tastes and beautiful odors. This argument reflects his view that beauty adds to goodness a relation to the cognitive faculty, since the beautiful is something pleasant to apprehend. Aquinas emphasizes the cognitive aspect of the apprehension of beauty in his discussion of due proportion as a criterion of beauty, for the senses delight in things duly proportioned as in what is after their own kind, because even sense is a sort of reason, just as every cognitive faculty. Now, since knowledge is by assimilation and similarity relates to form, beauty properly belongs to the nature of a formal cause. Thomas observes as an empirical fact that no irrational animal takes delight in beauty as beauty. Rather, recognition of beauty is unique to human beings as a rational animal. While the senses are bestowed upon both human beings and other animals for the purpose of procuring the necessities of life, other animals take delight in the objects of the senses only as ordered to food and sex. By contrast, man alone takes pleasure in the beauty of sensible objects for its own sake. Aquinas defines beauty both synthetically as being order and analytically as being that which requires integrity, proportion, and clarity. And of all these principles of beauty, especially order and proportion, are quite obviously only supersensorily cognoscible. Supersensory cognoscibility means that these principles of beauty, such as order and proportion, are not directly sensed by the eyes or ears alone, but are known only through a combination of sensory input and intellectual or rational comprehension. In Aquinas' writings are found three key principles of beauty. First, beauty is pleasing when apprehended to the senses, the intellect, the affectivity, the whole person. Second, there is in humans a general desire for beauty. Everybody loves the beautiful. Third, there are three conditions for beauty which lie in the intelligible form: integrity, clarity, and proportion. For Aquinas, these three conditions serve as objective criteria that serve as the basis of aesthetic judgment. What is entailed by each of these criteria? Thomas explains in the Summa Theologiae, for beauty includes three conditions: integrity or proportion, since those things which are impaired are by the very fact ugly; due proportion or harmony; and lastly, brightness or clarity, whence things are called beautiful which have a bright color. Clarity means that each form has its own radiance or luminosity, claritas, that is either pleasing to the senses, such as a beautiful flower, or pleasing to the intellect, as in the clarity of a successfully deduced mathematical equation. In addition to clarity, harmony, consonantia, sounding together, and proportion, debita proportio, are essential parts of beauty pertaining to the form of an object. Aquinas asserts, hence beauty consists in due proportion, for the senses delight in things duly proportioned, as in what is after their own kind. For Aquinas, clarity and proportion are there in the object to be discovered by our reason and are connected to the contemplative life. As he argues in his Summa Theologiae, beauty, as stated above, consists in a certain clarity and due proportion. Now, each of these is found radically in the reason, because both the light that makes beauty seen and the establishment of due proportion among things belong to reason. Hence, since the contemplative life consists in an act of the reason, there is beauty in it by its very nature and essence. Wherefore it is written of the contemplation of wisdom, I became a lover of her beauty. The third criterion required for a thing to be beautiful is wholeness or integrity, integritas. Applying these criteria to the human body, the beauty of the human body pertains to the form of an individual's physical constitution with its radiance, complexion, the harmony of its proportion, and its integrity or wholeness. As Thomas writes, hence the beauty of the body consists in a man having his bodily limbs well proportioned, together with a certain clarity of color. Where does beauty, in particular clarity and proportion, come from? Aquinas cites Dionysius on the divine names, that the beauty or comeliness that results from the concurrence of clarity and due proportion is from God, who is said to be beautiful, and is the cause of the harmony and clarity in the universe. The basis of aesthetic judgment in Kant. Immanuel Kant begins his critique of judgment with the thesis, a judgment of taste is aesthetical. Throughout his critique of judgment, Kant moves towards equating aesthetic judgment with what he calls judgments of taste. In contrast to Aquinas' emphasis on the cognitive aspect of aesthetic judgment, what makes judgments of taste aesthetic for Kant was precisely the fact that they were subjective and non-cognitive. In his critique of judgment, he builds upon what he labels the transcendental aesthetic in his first critique, as he engages in an inquiry into the fundamental conditions of sensory experience as the forms in which the mind is able to receive the manifold of intuitions. The term transcendental is not used by Kant in the same way as Aquinas, who employed it to speak of the ontological status of beauty as a property that belongs to every being and existing and is notionally distinct from unity, truth, being, and goodness. Kant uses the term transcendental to refer to knowledge that is not derived from experiences, but is a priori within the subject, a move which contributes to the subjectivization of beauty. In sharp contrast to Aquinas, who based his aesthetic judgment in objective features of the world, for Kant, aesthetic pleasure is ultimately subjective in the sense as being rooted in a subject's experience. Kant argues that the judgment of taste is therefore not a judgment of cognition and is subsequently not logical but aesthetical, by which we understand that whose determining ground can be no other than subjective. The type of judgment or evaluation proposed by Kant involves an aesthetic attitude or point of view, a special kind of perception, distinct powers of discrimination or taste and sensibility, or an association with particular sensation or emotion. Yet, unlike Aquinas, for whom pleasure also had a central place in his aesthetics, and unlike his habitual practice with almost all other cardinal concepts in the third critique, Kant takes virtually no interest in explaining to his readers just what he understands by his highly varied uses of the word pleasure. In the critique of judgment, Kant distinguishes between determining judgments, which involve the sorting of the particular under the universal of an already established concept, and reflective judgments that involve seeking a universal for a particular. He classifies scientific inquiry with its hypothesizing, testing, and analyzing as determining judgments, while reflective judging pertains to aesthetic judgments, especially the beauty of nature. 4 moments of aesthetic judgment. In Kant's account, aesthetic judgments consist of 4 moments: a quantity, a quality, a relation, and a modality. By beginning with quality, Kant is enabled to determine the quantity of the aesthetic judgment more easily by arguing from the disinterestedness to the universality of aesthetic pleasure. Kant's first moment of aesthetic judgment, quality, is based on a feeling of disinterested pleasure. What does he mean by disinterestedness? For Kant, disinterestedness means that the satisfaction that determines the judgment of taste neither arises out of nor arouses a desire for the object. Disinterested pleasure for Kant is that pleasure derived from the contemplation of an object as it immediately appears to us, without regard to what kind of object it is, or any desire on our part to make practical use of it. To employ an illustration from everyday life, beautiful objects do not serve ordinary human purposes as plates and spoons do. A beautiful rose pleases us, but not because we necessarily want to eat it or even pick it for a flower arrangement. This disinterestedness sharply distinguishes judgments of beauty from cognitive and moral judgments. Aesthetic judgments do not rise out of a desire for the moral good or some practical end. When it comes to judgments, Kant argues, that of taste in the beautiful is alone disinterested and free satisfaction, for no interest either of sense or of reason here forces our assent. It is here perhaps that a point of contact may be seen between Kant and Aquinas' insistence on beauty as a formal cause rather than a final cause. Didowski suggests that this would perhaps find a way of understanding the special place of beauty as evidence when Kant distinguishes aesthetic judgments from moral and practical judgments. The second moment of judgment of taste, according to quantity, involves a claim to the universality of the judgment. Kant grounds its claim for universality in disinterested pleasure. He argues, For the fact of which everyone is conscious that the satisfaction is for him quite disinterested implies in his judgment a ground of satisfaction for all human beings. This universal assent to the aesthetic judgment is due to the disinterested, non-egotistic grounding of the judgment, drawing on perceptual and imaginative faculties possessed by all. We expect that others, taking the proper contemplative stance, will concur. The universal assent is based on a shared aesthetic attitude or point of view, rather than on the object being viewed on the basis of objective criteria. Kant's claim of the universal validity of aesthetic judgments is grounded on two facts: that any idiosyncratic or personal interests and desires have been set aside, and that only shared perceptual faculties are involved without the need for agreement on matters intellectual or conceptual. According to Kant, universal assent to aesthetic judgment does not require a concept. Since Kant does not consider aesthetic judgments to be cognitive judgments, aesthetic judgments are not based on rules or prescribed principles that compel us to recognize something as beautiful. Along with this, Kant emphasizes the singularity of aesthetic judgments, that we speak of a particular flower as beautiful on the strength of our immediate experience, not as a conclusion from a premise about all flowers, or even flowers of this kind are like. Kant's third movement of judgment of taste considers the subjective purposiveness in the representation of an object without any purpose. Here he reiterates the difference between aesthetic judgments of beauty and value judgments of good based on some end. Kant describes beauty as the form of the purposeness of an object, so far as this is perceived in it without any representation of a purpose. Dodowski finds in this point a comparison with Aquinas that this purposelessness, purposiveness, is perhaps reminiscent of Aquinas' claim that beauty belongs to a formal causality rather than final causality, so that to delight in an object is to delight in the form of an object, not in the end of the object as such. The fourth moment of Kant's judgment of taste regards the modality of the satisfaction of the object. Kant states, "The beautiful is that which, without any concept, is cognized as the object of necessary satisfaction." What kind of necessity is involved in aesthetic judgments? In trying to reconcile that view that an aesthetic judgment is subjective must be autonomous and based upon subjective feelings of pleasure or displeasure, with the opposed view that aesthetic judgments may claim universal assent, Kant argues that the judgment functions as exemplary. By exemplary, he means a necessity of the assent of all to a judgment which is regarded as the example of a universal rule that we cannot state. The subject presumes that under the same circumstances, people would think the object is beautiful, or rather concur in the judgment. Thomas Aquinas and Immanuel Kant represent what may be described as the objective and subjective approaches to the basis of aesthetic judgment, respectively. Aquinas locates beauty in the object, but for Kant, beauty is in the mind of the subject. Aesthetic judgment for Thomas is cognitive and based on the objective criteria in the object, while Kant's approach is based on feelings and an attitude of disinterestedness based on an object's purposiveness without a purpose. While the universality of objective judgment for Thomas is based on the object meeting the criteria of integrity, proportion, and clarity, for Kant, universality is based on shared subjective reaction to an object based on disinterestedness.